Chapter 7. Half of Hugh's men were already gone. The other half remained at camp, packing the last of their things while Hugh took a final piss. There was no use lingering where they might be found. His men had said there was talk about interlopers and that young Malcolm was already snooping around. If Malcolm should happen to venture into McLean territory, he'd most certainly discover their camp. Hugh was quite pleased with himself. It was the bonfire Eleanor had spoken of, the flame that should not die before his work was done. Last night, after stashing all their offerings in the MacKinnons' stable, they'd stolen McLean cloaks and then snuck in to finish rebuilding whatever homes they could. Most were finished, and now it was time to leave, before the celebration ended and the drunkards all went stumbling home. Hugh remembered very well how stout their ushke was, although it wasn't stout enough to keep those bastards from drawing their swords. It was time to go. Hopefully his daughter Paige would discover his gifts to her and then realize what all he'd done. Until then, it was quite enough to know that Eleanor knew he'd made amends. "Hugh FitzSimon!" he heard a woman shout. Could it be Eleanor? Hugh froze upon hearing his name, dropping his tunic and pulling up his trews. The forest was dark, no sign of that strange blue aura. Whoever the woman was, she had yet to shed her mortal coil. Instinctively, although he knew not how or why, he realized it must be Paige, and as though to prove his point, she called him yet again. "Papa!" She screamed this time. Hugh felt a sudden rush of excitement. Mayhap she'd already discovered his gifts, and she'd come to beg him not to leave. Bolting through the woods toward the sound of Paige's voice, Hugh realized as he went that it wasn't a happy shout. Snatching up his bow from the sling on his back, he plucked an arrow from his quiver and then skidded to a halt once he spied the pair, his bow and arrow poised within his hands. "Afric," he said, with no small amount of surprise. "Hello, father." Malcolm wasn't far into the woods when he spotted the figure of a man, slightly luminescent and strangely manifested. There were folks who claimed this was a time between times, when the division between this world and the next was at its thinnest, leaving the way open for fairies and brownies to venture into the realms of men. He'd heard stories of banshees wailing on the night, foreshadowing the dead, but this form moved silently through the trees, beckoning Malcolm to follow wherever it went. It moved swiftly, darting behind pinewood and lichen-painted oaks. Finally, they crossed a burn onto McLean land. Strangely familiar though the man appeared to be, Malcolm couldn't tell exactly who it was until they stood at the fork of a wooded path. If you went one way, the road led to Brodie Land. The other way ventured toward his grandfather's house. It was a place Malcolm rarely went, for old man McLean was not the most affable of men. He considered going there now, fearful of what the apparition meant, and then he spied the man's face. It was Dougal McLean, though not on his deathbed. The old man stood staring back at Malcolm, his bright blue eyes seemingly filled with words his mouth could no longer move to say. "I'm sorry," he whispered into Malcolm's head. He was sorry they'd not known each other better. Sorry he'd poisoned his mother against his da. He wished Mari did not leave them so young. But most of all, he wanted Malcolm to know he would never be far, that he would keep watch over him in death the way he never had in life. And to this point, there was something he wanted Malcolm to see. Malcolm's skin prickled, though not with fear. For the first time in his life, he felt a calm deep in his soul, until he heard the scream. Old man McLean pointed in the direction of his home and then dissolved into mist, and Malcolm automatically withdrew his sword from its scabbard, the sound a hiss in the night. Without thinking or hesitating, his feet began to move. He went stealthily through the woods, knowing his greatest vantage was the element of surprise. Now came another scream, and it wasn't a scream of pleasure, not by far. Malcolm followed the sound, but he didn't have far to go. He saw the outline of a man standing in the shadows, and he slid behind a pine tree for cover. His eyes were well enough adjusted to the darkness, for he'd been traipsing through the forest ever since slipping away from the celebration. The stranger was wearing mail, English, he surmised, holding a bow and arrow, taking aim, now drawing back the string. Malcolm located his target. It took him a full moment to realize what was happening, and then he couldn't believe his eyes. He'd known something was amiss, and now there was proof. Hugh FitzSimon held an arrow aimed at his daughter's head, rearing back, ready to let fly. The fact that she was struggling against another man didn't immediately strike Malcolm as it should. There wasn't time to consider. All he knew was that Paige was in her father's sights, and if he didn't intervene right now, the odious man would finally kill her after all these years. Without fear, he lunged after FitzSimon, his sword finding purchase in the man's back, straight through his heart. But FitzSimon had already loosed his arrow. It happened so swiftly. Paige screamed again, and Malcolm saw only in that instant that the arrow must not have been intended for her at all. It went straight through a man's head, felling him at his stepmother's feet. Paige gave a cry and ran straight into her father's arms just as he crumpled to the ground. Malcolm stood, confused, watching the scene unfold. "Papa!" Paige cried. Hugh was more than aware that his blood was spilling into the cold, wet earth, but he rested easily, knowing his arrow had found its mark. That was one thing the years could never wrest from him. Even as his legs had slowed and his belly fattened, he could still wield that bow. "Papa!" she cried, her lips quivering with emotion. Hugh always loved that about her, the fact that she loved so freely, even when it wasn't returned. Eleanor had been that way as well, up until the end. His sight dimming, Hugh squinted up at his only daughter, the beautiful woman she had become, confused by the turn of these events. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. He'd only meant to help. Hadn't Eleanor said he would have another chance? In that instant, the forest light took on that strange blue hue, and suddenly everything seemed so very clear. The chance wasn't for him. It was for his heirs. As for Hugh, this would be his end. Strangely, he wasn't afraid. He was merely cold, intensely cold. Another pair of wide blue eyes peered down at him, this pair over his daughter's shoulder. "Malcolm," he said, recognizing the face no matter how old the boy was grown. "You're a fine lad," he said. These were his very last words. "Hang on, Papa! Hurry, Mal! Go get your da!" Paige commanded the lad. "You'll find him in the stables! Hurry! Now go!" Hugh's breath came more labored. The sound of his own breathing became amplified to his ears while Paige's voice drifted away. She was sobbing. Poor, poor girl. The sound of her grief hurt his heart, which seemed to be beating all the more slowly now. He heard crispy leaves rustle as Malcolm dashed away. Realizing he was nearly out of time, Hugh struggled to remove the ring from his swollen finger. This was all he could give Paige now, his legacy, for she was Aldurg's rightful heir. He managed to remove the sigil ring, pushing it wordlessly into her hand. He tried to speak, but tinny blood gushed up through his lips. "Oh, no, 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 no!" Paige shook her head. "Papa!" she pleaded brokenly. "Oh, Papa, I love you!" Papa?" He heard her say this over and over like a litany in his head. "I love you, Papa." He recognized the truth in her eyes. She loved him still, even after all these years, even after all he'd done. Words refused to form upon his lips, and still he opened his mouth in an attempt to speak. "I love you," he longed to say, and closed his eyes, recalling Eleanor's words. "You will know love when 'tis returned." With Hugh's dying breath, his heart burst with joy. And then he spied her, his wife, seated beside the hearth fire, dressed resplendently in velvet red and wearing his cloak. The room was brightly lit, and Hugh was no longer cold. Hugh stepped tentatively into the solar. Eleanor smiled at him, a radiant smile that put to shame the fire raging in the hearth. There was nothing frightening about her now. "You did not die alone," she said, her voice like music to his ears. "And yet I did everything you said," he told her, still confused. Eleanor rose from the chair and came to take Hugh by the hand, her gaze full of love as she enveloped him in her arms. Warmth and forgiveness filled him from his head to the tips of his toes. "My dearest love," she said, "I never promised you longer life. I merely gave you the gift of knowing and a chance to make amends and change the hand of fate." What happens now? Somewhere in the place Hugh left, his daughter wept for him still. The sound lingered faintly in the back of his head. He peered back at the doorway from whence it seemed he must have come. Beyond the solar where he now stood, in what should have been the hall, remained a forest that was growing darker by the second. Eleanor turned her hand, begging him once more to take it. "I hear Henry has already arrived. Shall we go?" "Henry, too? The old bugger." All trace of jealousy had fled, no longer doubting Eleanor's love. In another life, Hugh might have moved his mouth to ask where they would go, but he had no need of his voice. He already knew. He took Eleanor by the hand, and together they flew.